The claim that Jesus never really existed is sometimes heard on the internet, but it's not a claim that's taken seriously by the vast majority of credentialed historians. Take the example of the historian Bart Ehrman. He's a well-known skeptic, even an atheist, and a few years ago he felt the need to write a book called Did Jesus Exist? Now, he answers the question in the affirmative, but in the introduction to that book, he expresses how frustrated, even angry he is that he's had to waste time answering such a mind-numbingly obvious question. But he says there are still some at the lunatic fringe end of things who seem to think it's a live issue, and thus he wrote the book. Well, given that's the case, why do some people obsessively hang on to the idea that Jesus never existed? I think there are a number of reasons driving that claim. First, it's often based on an extreme sceptical view of history. I hear people say to me, we can't trust ancient documents. The gospel writers had an agenda. We can't know anything about the historical Jesus, and on and on and on it goes. The problem is, if you take that extreme skepticism and you apply it universally, you end up concluding we can't know anything about any history. It's such a radical skepticism, it erodes not Jesus, but in fact all ancient history. Second problem with the idea that Jesus never existed, that the Gospels are myth, is most people who claim that have no idea what myths actually are. The Oxford professor C.S. Lewis, who was a world expert in myths, that was his training, wrote this. He said, when I encounter somebody who tells me that Jesus was a myth, I always like to ask them, how many myths have you actually read? Because, he said, I have read hundreds, if not thousands of myths in my academic career, and I can tell you the Gospels are not myths. You see, one of the hallmarks of myths is they usually take place in a realm disconnected from space and time. The Gospels, in contrast, are deeply rooted into history and space and time. They talk about names and dates and places and historical events and political leaders and all kinds of things that show that the Gospel writers were rooting their story in space and time and history. What genre, what type of writing are the Gospels? They are not myths. They are Greco-Roman biographies. Well, there's one last problem with the idea that Jesus never existed, that the Gospels were made up by the early church, and it's this. We know from other documents the kind of issues and concerns that the early church Christians, the first Christians, were concerned with. They were concerned with questions about the relationship between Jews and Gentiles, the nature of the Jewish law, and the biggest kind of theological question of all in the early church, the question of circumcision. Well, look at the Gospels and the Jesus we find there. He doesn't really talk about those issues, which raises the strange conundrum, why on earth would the early church invent a Jesus who doesn't talk about anything useful to them? It's simply bizarre. The much more natural conclusion is the Jesus of the Gospels is the Jesus of history. Well, if it's so hard to sustain the argument that Jesus never existed, why do some skeptics continue to beat that dead horse? Well, the atheist historian Bart Ehrman said this. He said the motive driving the claim that Jesus never existed is not historical, it's ideological. And I think Bart is absolutely right. You see, if Jesus existed, it demonstrates that God exists, and not just the kind of absent theoretical God of the philosophers, but a God who is involved in history, a God who is close and personal, a God who confronts us in the person of Jesus. And many of my atheist friends don't want to be that confronted, and thus I think they're actually afraid of Jesus because of the conclusions they would have to draw from his life and ministry. And what better way to deal with a Jesus that challenging than to try and wipe him from history? But that is not history, that's ideology.